Sorry, Nick, I think I accidentally muted you. I pressed the wrong thing.
That's okay. Thanks to everyone and welcome to our discussion tonight. My name's Nic Maclellan. I'm with the Brunswick Residents Network. We're here in Brunswick in Merribeck, newly renamed, on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, land that was never ceded. Thanks for joining us tonight. This is part of a elections program organised by Brunswick Residents Network. In 10 days' time, on Thursday, the 20th of October, we'll be holding a candidates forum for people running for the seat of Brunswick. I'd like to acknowledge Tim Reed, who's on the group with us tonight, who's the local member currently for Brunswick. Welcome, Tim. And also acknowledge Councillor Sue Bolton, who's with us. We have apologies from Mayor Mark Riley, who's committed to another meeting tonight.
And also, I think we have apologies from Councillor Hart, Monica Hart
as well. So the candidates meeting on the 20th at the Uniting Church in Sydney Road will be an opportunity for people to quiz people standing for the seat of Brunswick. But tonight is more of a information and education session. One of the things we thought was really important was an opportunity to flag some of the key changes that are in the pipeline with the state government after the elections. Presuming that there's not a change of government, there are some significant policy developments that have been underway for some time and may be rolled out pretty quickly after the election. There are issues around what's been called the planning assessment model. There are issues for the planning system in relation to VCAT, the Victorian Civil Administrative Tribunal, and centrally, the fundamental question about how community members can be involved in the planning system in the state. We're very lucky to have with us tonight one of the leading people who can talk to us about this, Stephen Rowley. Stephen has been an advocate, an academic, an author on planning issues in Victoria. He literally wrote the book, The Victorian Planning System, Practice, Problems and Prospects. And so tonight we're going to get him to start off with about 20 minutes of introduction, talking about the Victorian planning system and what changes might be in the wind in coming months. After his presentation, we'll have some questions and open up for people to raise points. I'd like to point out that tonight's aim is to really think big picture, not to focus on individual projects that may be happening in your part of the neighbourhood, not to talk about core, small issues, but to look a bit big picture about what's happening statewide to the planning system. We hope, however, that it will spark some issues and questions that you may have that could be put either to Stephen tonight or people who are running as candidates for the seat of Brunswick and possibly Pascoe Vale further down the track. So with no further ado, I'll hand over and invite Stephen to kick off with some comments today.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks, everyone. Good to see you all. I think there are a few familiar faces in the group. Some of you all have been involved in things like Bunnings or presented to the Brunswick Residents Network before. So hello. I am going to speak to some slides. It's my uni lecturer kind of like background coming to me, but it also will help me to just kind of like ramble a bit less. So I'll just get those up on screen. Hopefully you can arrange your window so that you can still actually see my face. So
thanks, Stephen. We can see those slides. Thank you.
All right, excellent. So as I said, as Nick has said, I'm a planning practitioner now. I still do a little bit of teaching, but I am basically a full-time planning consultant. I worked at Moreland for 7 years and I wrote this book, which is up on the screen if you are interested in reading more. Oh, I see. I was at the last slide. There we go. Let me try that again. pretty slick. You're not seeing a share screen at the moment, are you? Was that a no? Sorry, I was just rearranging my windows.
That's a no. Sorry, we haven't got anything yet. Okay.
Hopefully
that's
now
great.
you are.
Yep.
All right. So I've headed this planning 2022 to 2026 because I was asked particularly about what's likely to happen after the election. And we are speculating a bit. And one reason why we're speculating so much is in the story of these two press releases. The first is a press release from November 2020. And you can see, I haven't cropped that very well, but you can see the heading there, planning revamp to boost economic recovery and jobs. This was back in 2020. There was a big planning allocation for a set of planning reforms. Some of you may remember there's a set of planning reforms called smart planning that sort of wound down a couple of years ago. But there was this budget allocation in 2020 to, as it says there, improvement of planning processes based on a review by the Commissioner for Better Regulation. That's the sort of red tape commissioner. And I'll come to that review in a moment. But you can see there's these references to a new assessment model for development proposals greater than 50 million that will make approvals processes simpler and quicker for these developments. So there is some reference to sort of fast tracking of the planning process, but there wasn't really much detail. And there are a lot of rumours going around, and there has been discussion of various fast track models. There have been some fast track clauses introduced for certain classes of development, particularly housing. There's big housing build program has its own clause. Public housing generally has its own clause in the scheme now. But we never got a proper explanation of what that planning program was. There were people working in government on it. There were a lot of rumours going around. But some of you will recall this all got thrown out. This is the second press release in March 2022, where as part of the fallout from the social housing levy getting canned, a lot of you might remember that they were proposing a social housing levy. There's a glorious 14 days where that was a potential planning policy. The property council, depending on who you listen to, the property sector did not, various people will say the property council did not honour their commitments to the government. Others say those commitments never made. It sort of doesn't really matter. The government essentially said, well, if we're going to can the social housing levy that we'd proposed, but we're also in what was more or less explicitly framed by the government as an act of retaliation, say you're not getting your planning reform package. And you can see the phrasing there in that second highlighted passage there is the government made one thing clear: for these reforms to proceed, there would need to be returns to the Victorian community by supporting a stronger and more sustainable social and affording housing sector. So the package is off the table for good. Now, a couple of things there. It means we don't know exactly what the government was moving forward with. One could also note on the way through that it's quite extraordinary to abandon a set of planning reforms on the basis that you didn't get some other unrelated objective through. Planning reforms, if they're worth doing, should be worth doing, not as part of a quid pro quo. If they really are that much of just a one-sided gift to the property sector, that's a worry in terms of how those were framed in the first place. The other thing about that is, it's one thing to say that the package is off the table for good, but if you never actually announce what the package involved, it's pretty easy to put things back on the table and no one can ever, call you on it, right? Because they say they're not going to do them, but we don't know exactly what they're going to do. So we're in this strange space now where this was obviously only in March. There is limited information out there about what they were proposing, and it's theoretically off the table. The other complication, which again, I'm sure a lot of you will be aware of, probably most of you will be aware of, Richard Wynne moved on as planning minister. We have Lizzie Blanthorne in the seat at the moment. But there have obviously been difficulties involving conflict of interest with Lizzie Blanthorne. So I think we'd just be speculating in terms of who's likely to be the planning minister in a returned Andrews government. We might have more certainty about who would be the planning minister in a Matthew Guy-led government if we could remember who the shadow planning minister is. I must admit I can't off the top of my head, which isn't a great sign. Yeah, that's another discussion. I will briefly return to what happens if the opposition wins. You can look up what is public, is that Better Regulation Victoria report that they say did inform their project of their reform agenda. There are a few suggestions in there, some of which are a bit strange. There is a flirtation with proponent-initiated planning scheme amendments, and I just mentioned that because there's long been pressure for at the moment, only a council or a planning minister can, for most practical purposes, initiate a planning scheme amendment. If the planning scheme, for example, prohibits a development, a developer can't say, oh, I would like to change the planning scheme so that my development is allowed and initiate that amendment. Because there's essentially no recognition of a developer leading a planning scheme amendment process to change the planning scheme. The Better Regulation Victoria report doesn't quite go down the road of saying that proponents could initiate amendments, but it does talk about essentially creating a process whereby if a proponent, a developer, proposed an amendment, there would be some onus on councils to respond formally and to reply to it. So it isn't quite a true proponent-initiated amendment process, but it is inching in that direction. I just thought that was interesting. There is a lot of discussion in that report about various system streams. This is a real preoccupation with planning reform going back 10 years. They like to create lots of streams, fast-track streams, special project streams, all sorts of different streams. And in particular, they talk about this idea of a VicSmart Plus model, which would sit between the current standard application process that most planning applications go through and the VicSmart process, which some may be familiar with, which is a very fast-track, no advertising, 10-day planning process. The VicSmart Plus would be sort of sitting somewhere in between. I will talk in a moment, though, about what I think is a more significant suggestion in that sort of general space of system streams. There is also talk about special streams for state significant projects and state significant precincts. And certainly the rumours that we heard about what was being proposed before it all got shelved, the rumours going around in the industry were very heavily based around the idea of various fast-track models for the planning minister to facilitate and speed up and fast-track various kinds of state significant development. Having said that, it's a funny review. I don't particularly like the tone of it because it is so red tape cutting, and it doesn't, in my view, have a very good focus on trying to improve development. It is all just about how to make the system faster, and I think that's kind of an unhelpful review. But it's actually pretty vague. If you look at that review, I do recommend, if you are interested, you can Google it and find it. It's pretty vague and it's pretty high level, and so it sort of ends up being a bit inoffensive because it doesn't get into too much detail. And certainly, I think in a lot of the reforms they were talking about, the devil would have been in the detail. The other thing that has been floating around, though, and that I was asked to talk about, and certainly I'm interested in talking about because it's something I've been very interested about, and I've written a very long piece that's on my website if you do want to read more, is there was this paper in November 2021 called Improving the Operation of ResCode, which proposes what's called a performance assessment module model. I think it is performance assessment model, not planning assessment model, but certainly PAMS. And they're what is called a deemed to comply control. And what it would do is, so what that means in practice is they would be using res code, the current planning controls for medium density infill housing, so unit proposals. They would be using the existing res code standards that govern those sort of things and that you'd be familiar with the outcomes from. They would be using those as a test bed for a new module, a new planning scheme assessment framework called PAMS. And what it would mean is if a development complied with the quantitative res code standards, so to get that out of planning language, the res code controls have various things like, envelope diagrams that go with certain setbacks out from boundaries, certain side setbacks, certain height controls. And they have a whole lot of controls that are much more subjective or qualitative. And when you're a planner assessing them at a council, you have to make a judgment both about whether the setbacks are appropriate, but you can also say different setbacks might be warranted. And you also have to form a view that the proposal is reasonably appropriate with regards to the character of the area. The PAMS model would essentially take all those subjective requirements out, and it would say if you fit within those envelopes, you are deemed to comply. It doesn't not need a permit, and I'll explain a bit more about this in a moment, but it still goes through the process, but it would be exceedingly hard for council to refuse an application that met those purely numerical aspects of res code. It would also mean that if you met those standards, you wouldn't be able to consider any local policy. So it would mean that, and this is more significant in some areas than others, and I know there is, there is local planning policy about character in the Moreland scheme, but that policy would essentially be functionally removed if developers could meet those standards. And they are, while they're initially proposing that as a res code model, clearly DELP, and they're explicit about this in the paper, clearly DELP, the planning department are proposing to roll that out to other kinds of planning controls. And I just want to highlight a couple of things in that paper. There's just this interesting reference here, which is the highlighted passage where it says the PAM for neighbourhood character is based on the premise which underpins the proposed model that in most settings, the existing quantitative res code standards referring to neighbourhood character will, without modification, deliver development that respects the neighbourhood character of the location, which in my view is quite a bold call on their part. And the other passage here that I think is really important, I got pretty angry with the planning department, had a fairly feisty exchange with someone at DELP on social media in the days after this was released, because this passage here is in my view, a flat out lie, and it's unusual to see something so dishonest, frankly, in a paper released by a government department. Translating the res code standards to PAMS will not change the content of established standards or affect the procedural settings that currently apply to the assessment of proposals, including third-party notice or appeal rights. And the reason I say that is dishonest is it is in a way sort of technically true that they're keeping those standards, the setback diagrams would be the same and the like. But the reality is you can have third-party notice rights, and you can have the right, so as in, notices go out to neighbours. You can have appeal rights, you can go off to VCAT. But I'll tell you what, if you're a neighbour and you had a PAM compliant development next to you and you said, can you run this appeal? I wouldn't be taking your money. It would be a rip-off. I'd be absolutely ripping you off to take your money because there would be no prospect of winning at the tribunal. You would essentially have literally no grounds. And so one of the oddities here is it would be creating, I think, a kind of a set of zombie applications proceeding through the system with very, very, and proceeding to appeal with really no scope for any useful discussion at the planning appeal. So that is, I think, potentially quite a radical change. Now, we get into the realm of rumour and scuttlebutt here. I have a feeling well, that was released in November 2021. Nothing further has happened. You could speculate, did they put it on the back burner because they're afraid of dropping it before an election? Were they? And this is what I believe is the case. I think DELP were probably told that was a bit too bold at a political level, but this is just speculation. Certainly, I think if it went ahead, it would be a very dramatic change to the kind of forms you'd see existing. And I know people don't love res code, but what would become a lot more common, and this is a photo that I took out in St Albans in a residential growth zone. This is what happens if you really build out to the maximum extent to those res code quantitative envelopes. And look, some of you will say you've seen development looks like this in Brunswick, and there would be places where development like this that is as bad as this has occurred. And, you know, I sympathise with you if you've ended up next to this kind of thing. But it is also the case that it is still much more common for res code development to be less intense than this. It's more often two-storey. There's usually some areas where it steps down a bit at the back. There's usually better landscaping. There's, you know, a bit more greenery. The PAM model, because it essentially says the development is okay if it fills out that res code envelope, it's deemed to be okay. There's no more room for judgment. Any kind of like local policy doesn't get applied. This kind of like maxing out of lots with the kind of like side facing terraces up to 3 stories, depending on the area, would become, in my view, much, much more common than it currently is. And, you know, I think that's a pretty bad outcome. And I would be saying that resident groups generally should be communicating as firmly as they can through their political candidates that the PAM model, and particularly the PAM model applied to res code, is on their radar and is something that political candidates should be hearing from residents group now. I personally would be more worried about this than some of these kind of like fast track models for state significant projects and the like, just because I think this would have a much more widespread effect. Just before I finish up, I did just think, and I alluded to this before, I was like, I don't really know what the opposition are talking about in a planning sense. I went looking, I had a look at Matthew Guy's website, couldn't find much. The main planning policy that I'm aware of that the Liberals are proposing is to make the worst planning minister we've had premier. I'm not sure if that counts, but that seems to be their main planning related policy. There's a lot of sort of ending lockdowns, the kind of like friendly to small business kind of focus you'd expect. But I just had a look at the industry. I got the latest copy of Planning News. This is the planning industry magazine that you get if you're a Planning Institute member. This is October, so a month out from the planning, a month or so out from the state election. There is a column in here by the shadow planning minister, which will remind me what his name is. And it's all about Ryan Smith. It's all about the Olympic Games. So I'm just not, and to be honest, they don't seem to be terribly engaged in a planning space. Now, Labor sort of aren't either, but by virtue of being the party of government, they're probably a bit more active in the space. And as I've just been doing, we can talk about what they've been mooting for the last 4 years. So I suppose that's a little bit different, and perhaps not comparing apples and oranges in that sense. Yeah, you can read more of my stuff there. That's my consulting page, and also my my webpage where I have a lot of writing about planning. I talk about, there's a very long piece there talking about the planning assessment module and the res code changes. If you are interested in reading more, it's often pretty kind of like directed at other planners, just by the nature of who ends up reading my stuff. But yeah, you can read more there. I'll stop there, Nick, because I know I've been talking for a bit over 20 minutes. So yeah, thank you. I'll stop sharing my slides.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That's flagged a whole number of issues. One question that came up in the chat was where can we get the book? I'd encourage people to go to all good bookstores, and you can order a copy, unless Stephen has a particular place that he'd like to recommend.
No, I mean, I do usually point people to Booktopia. I would be remiss, or the publisher, like Federation Press, can sell it to you directly. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that there will likely be a new edition out early next year. So I'm working on updating it. So, you know, I'd love you to buy it twice, but given it is reasonably expensive, I think you can get it for $80 or $90. So, you know, maybe not that expensive by sort of more technical book standards, but it's not cheap, and I wouldn't want people to be buying it twice if they didn't have to. But so yeah, just full disclosure there.
Not wanting to steal Stephen's royalties, but it is available in the Merribeck Library system. I have actually read it through the library, so there you go. So thank you very much. We've got another half an hour. We'd like to open up for questions. For those that have just joined us a bit later in the discussion, the aim of tonight is to focus on the big picture, looking at these broad planning system things that are coming up. We don't particularly want to focus on individual projects in Merribeck municipality, but there's certainly opportunities to talk offline about those, and as Brunswick Residents Network, we'd be happy to do so. We will be hosting another meeting coming up at the Uniting Church in Sydney Road, 214 Sydney Road, on Thursday the 20th, which is our candidates meeting. Before each election, BRN hosts a forum that allows you as local residents or community members to ask questions of people who are running for the local seat of Brunswick. And we'd encourage you to come along, primed with questions that have come out of tonight, to quiz the candidates who will be vying for your vote. BRN doesn't endorse candidates. We're not aligned to any political party, but we do think it's important to create opportunities like this, firstly, to discuss what's happening in our neighbourhoods, and secondly, to ensure that the candidates who want to represent us have some knowledge about these central issues. I might start off, Joanna Stanley had a question, and then if people would like to just put their name in the chat that you'd like to ask a question, I'll come to you in sequence. So if you do have a question, you can either write it down or just put your name in, and I'll go through the chat one by one and call up. As I say, we have half an hour, so I'll hand over to Jo.
Yeah, look, I'm more than happy not to ask a question, really. I'd rather flip to the gallery here, I guess, the audience and the general public to you know, put questions in. But I just wanted to, I was just flicking through the names, and I can see tonight we've got Emeritus Professor Michael Buxton in the gallery. I think that's probably because I'm having a chat with him on Wednesday, and I've alerted him to tonight. But I mean, if he wants to ask a question himself, I was just going to ask Stephen to comment on the general, the term Michael uses about this being a deregulation of the planning system. So that was really it in a nutshell. So Stephen.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And, you know, I don't necessarily put it in quite the same terms as Michael, and I should say Michael and I know each other very well. So, you know, this is anything I say where it's kind of like slightly different from Michael's view is purely by the way of, you know, just different perspectives on things. There has been a very long, it depends a little bit what you're referring to, I suppose, in that sense. There's been a very long-standing sort of small government pressure on the planning system for going back 20, 30 years. And, you know, we academic types like to talk about like neoliberalism and whatever. Certainly, and I said this at the start, the Better Regulations Victoria, one of report. One of the annoying things about it is it purely seems to come from a very small government deregulatory perspective, and it's quite an irritating review in that sense. So I certainly agree that, it has a few kind of like throwaway things about, we've got to make sure the planning system is working, but working more effectively. It is certainly from that kind of like cutting red tape angle. I don't like to be too declarative about, this is a complete deregulation of the planning system, precisely because what I alluded to, that there is so little in the public realm about what they're proposing to do. The performance assessment module, it will be very clear. I do think, I suppose you could say that's a deregulation. The thing that is more egregious in my mind about the performance assessment module as they propose for Res Code is it is so badly designed. It would lead to such terrible outcomes that it's in my view just a very foolish and ill-considered piece of planning design, more than any kind of like ideological objection to it or anything like that. It's just it's very strange, and that is the kind of policy where, to be honest, I'm not quite sure the people who are putting it together realise how radical what they were proposing was. Civil servants are usually a bit more cautious than that, and I honestly think just the people writing that paper didn't have the level of operational experience to realise what kind of outcomes what they're proposing was going to lead to. So I think they probably overshot the mark in terms of trying to come up with something that was going to be somewhat facilitative for development. I think it's an odd one, and what I'm worried about is the lack of continuity at the minister's office with Richard Wynne leaving, with Lizzie Blandthorne there now, with we're not sure who'll be there after the election. I do worry that an inexperienced minister could foolishly sign something like that off. I suspect, my gut feeling is that the former minister's office was suspicious of it, but I'm a bit worried about what could happen after an election. Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
Thanks, Stephen. We had a question from Elizabeth. If you'd like to unmute and ask a question directly.
Yeah, thanks very much, Nick. Yeah, I've been fairly horrified by what Stephen's had to say. I'd just like to draw attention to the fact that last year the Legislative Council initiated an inquiry into the planning system. This was suggested by Clifford Hayes, who was from the Sustainability Party, who may or may not still be there after the next election. But anyway, over 200 groups and individuals put in submissions which outlined some of the basic problems with the planning system. The government then aborted the whole process, issued an interim report which said that we'll reinstitute it after the election. Stephen, do you think that they're likely to do this, and will it make any difference?
So I'm glad you asked me about it, because it was actually just going through my head as I was responding to the previous questions from Joe that I hadn't mentioned that inquiry. I wouldn't want to read the tea leaves as to what happens with it, but as I said, I'm glad you raised it, because it is, I think, an important balance to that red tape commission review. Like, if you think about kind of what you're aiming for when you review a planning system, the three pillars, in my view, should be effectiveness or efficacy. How effective is the planning system doing what it's supposed to do? Efficiency, that is important, making sure there's not too much regulatory burden, and sort of integrity and transparency. Is the system robust and free from corruption? If the Operation Sandon review is ever allowed to go out into the public realm, that might give us a bit of a focus on the integrity side. The Red Tape Commissioner has looked, I don't think terribly insightfully, but they have looked at the kind of efficiency side. And I think that parliamentary inquiry is important because it did have more of an effectiveness focus. That said, there have been a lot of reviews of the planning system over the last 20 years, a lot. I've been through it. I was putting together this list for the new edition of my book. It's about 1 every 2 years. To answer your specific question, Elizabeth, I'm not 100% sure what will happen with it. It's sort of reading the tea leaves in terms of who has the numbers and who has the influence in terms of government numbers, and that's sort of not my wheelhouse. But I do hope it is reconvened, because, as I said, I think it's an important balancer to the other ones that are on the books.
Could I note for the audience that Brunswick Residents Network put in a submission to that inquiry, and we're very pleased to see we've got quoted quite a lot, particularly about the issue of continuing to engage with members of the community in the planning system, that around issues of notification, right to appeal, right to review. We were strongly advocating that any planning changes needed to take account of the expertise in the community. So yeah, it's important. Helen Bender, there was a question early on from you, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thanks, Nic, and thanks, Stephen, for those insights. I was wondering, and maybe I'm asking too much for you to read tea leaves, but if you think it's possible to make planning a big issue at the upcoming election, and if so, how you would approach doing that?
It's an interesting question. I saw it on the chat, and so I'd sort of been mulling over it. I feel I'm the worst person to ask, and the reason I say that is I wrote the first edition of this book thinking I could have a real influence on the way planning would be done, and almost every planning reform decision that they've made in the last 6 years is almost the opposite to what I would have done. So I feel like I'm the last person to be trying to advise anybody on how they influence politicians and how they influence outcomes. I think there are a lot of community representatives who are probably better placed to give advice on that than I am, to be honest. I often feel a bit glum about my ability over the years to actually be an advocate for better planning system design, which is sort of the area I'm interested in. All I will say is, one reason why I'm interested in coming along to forums like this is I really do hope, my view is on that performance assessment module, for example, is really important that residents are just hammering their local representatives about things like that. Make sure they know it's on your radar, so that it's on their radar, and it feeds up the line, I guess, is something that the politicians are saying to each other. Hey, we're getting a lot of flack about this PAM model. Are we sure this is a good idea? Because ultimately, I assume that's the way they kind of the way they make decisions. But I wish I had better advice to give about how to be a better community advocate and political advocate.
Anyway, Stephen, I appreciate that, and your honesty about your glumness.
Once again, we acknowledge the presence of our local member on the call. I hope you're taking notes. And as mentioned, we have the candidates meeting coming up. I'd urge people tonight to come and earbash all the contenders for the seat. Councillor Sue Bolton is on the call and asked to put a question. Please go ahead.
Thanks. I sort of had two questions. One thing, there seems to be, from my position on council, an endless series of things that go through council or attempted to go through council which remove third-party appeal rights. Certainly that happened with a planning amendment in Coburg, but the latest one is actually going to council tomorrow night, and it's an incorporated planning overlay. And it just, the fact that these things keep going through council or attempted to go through council does fit in with what the, I'm not sure which smart track, fast track planning process they're part of in terms of the state planning scheme. But it really does worry me that these are so celebrated as being a way of getting a good outcome for the community, but the community doesn't know about what's being planned until something starts to be built. And then, I don't care how wonderful the planning staff might be. It doesn't mean that there won't be something which will be really rotten for residents when they find out what's planned that can be overlooked. I think So anyway, it's just like you might want to comment on how all of these various schemes that come up locally fit in with the planning scheme. And just the last thing I want to ask you, comment about land banking, because my feeling after watching especially Future Estate at Pentridge is I feel that developers shouldn't be allowed to sell a block of land after they get a permit. I don't think the permit should be sold with the land. And that might be a way of stopping land banking and manipulation of the market. And it'd be interesting just to find out what your thoughts are. Yeah, I mean, I'm just a layperson, so yeah, but it'd be good to get your thoughts about land banking and what might be done about it, because it does increase the cost of land and housing.
So on the DPO and IPO issues, DPOs and IPOs are two of the main mechanisms used to create these kind of like special approvals, usually for a whole little precinct. In my view, there is a gap between theory and reality is what you're seeing there. The theory is that if you do really detailed public consultation on a whole precinct, right, you should be doing that once, doing that right, embedding that answer in the planning scheme controls. And that's the theory as to why you then take the public rights out down the track. And that is a reasonable enough theory. I think the problem happens is that there is a gap between the theory and reality. There is just the practical fact that there are a whole lot of people who will not be involved at that initial stage. And so there are people who only find out about it later when they've lost the rights. There are gaps between the theory and reality in terms of how thoroughly that document reflects what was consulted on at the front, how much room there is and wriggle room for changes in outcomes down the track, all of those sort of things, how much uncertainty there is in the way everything's prescribed. That's where I think it really breaks down. And I agree, I get uncomfortable with some of the things that can be done under those kind of documents without going back to the community up front. And I think there are a lot of people who are not, there are a lot of planners who aren't super excited about those IPO and DPO documents either. The second part, the land banking thing, it's reasonable in principle. It's really tricky in practice because what you'd essentially have to do is say that the permit ceased to become a valid permit.
I'm sitting in the kitchen because I'm watching a meeting.
So I think
Laurel, sorry, could you please mute your phone? Everyone else, please. Thank you.
I've muted them. Anyway, the problem is to make that work, you'd have to have a situation where the permits cease to be valid if they got sold. And the difficulty with that would be the next owner could make an application. And what are you really going to, if you've just approved something, you're really going to say no if they just relodged for the same thing? What's the value add in kind of like making them reapply for the same thing? Like, I can understand the theory of it, but I think in practice, I don't know. I don't think it adds much to the process to have people reapplying for things that have essentially already been looked at and ticked off, whether it's by council, whether it's by VCAT or whatever. It's a bit of a fait accompli, that second application. So the question is, what's it adding to make them go through that process? But I understand the rationale, but I think in practice, it's hard to achieve.
Thanks, Stephen. The next comment and question came from Jay Robe. I don't know if you wanted to follow through on that comment.
I'm unmuting. Look, it was just the comment when you said that that they hadn't designed very good ideas for the planning scheme. I'm sure they've got lots of employees. Why is it that they're coming up with such crummy ideas?
Look, and to some extent, it might have been maybe it was a rhetorical question, but one of my endless frustrations talking to the planning system design people at DELP, because I have talked to them a fair bit over the years, and I worked there for a while. there is a broader problem, and it is an oddity about planning as a sort of political domain, in that there is this weird local council and state government split, and you essentially have local council doing all the day-to-day work, but state government setting up the system. And essentially it means the planning system is a car built by people who don't drive. And the discussion when I go in there and try and say these system design things aren't working, you're often trying to explain these kind of like subtle things about how the controls work to people who don't use the controls day to day. And so if I go back to my car analogy, you're sitting there going, they're looking at you and saying, well, I don't understand what's so inconvenient about having the accelerator on the roof behind your head. It's just up there. It's just right there. And you're going, yeah, but in practice, it would be so much easier if it was on the floor. And, you know, it can be really hard to explain. These areas are so complex and so detailed. But the problem is that res code paper has some names on it. And I'm not going to start like naming names. It has names of who worked on it. And they are people, none of them would have worked, would have issued a planning permit in the VPP era, which is since the early 2000s, the current era of sort of planning system design. I suspect it is likely none of the people working on that res code paper had ever issued or processed or assessed a res code permit. Certainly none of the named people had. So it's lack of familiarity with the day-to-day reality. Anyway, that's probably all I need to say about that. It was probably a slightly rhetorical question.
That does, however, just go on to our next question. How do we draw on the expertise of the community, you know, who are participants in the planning and transformation of our suburbs? And there's a question from Kim Stevenson on this question. Kim, if you'd like to unmute and join in. Thanks.
Hi. The question that's bothering me at the moment is the continuous erosion of third-party rights by state government amendments, as well as within planning schemes, the vague wording that allows very open interpretation of things that shouldn't be quite open. And my question is you tend to find out about these way down the track. So what's the best way that community and resident groups can effectively challenge this continuous erosion?
So to some extent, I'd give the same answer I gave before, which is that I'm not the best person to advise on that. But what I will say is, just on that question, on the sort of the substantive issue that's in your question, Kim, you know, you talk about erosion of third-party rights, and you're absolutely right. It is an ongoing pressure. It is something that occurs, I think, because it's one of the easiest levers to pull. When they're looking for ways to speed things up, it is one of the simplest things. There is a strong political pressure to keep third-party rights, like they are seen as a dangerous thing to wind back, and that's why they haven't been wound back quicker than they have been. But you're absolutely right, they get chipped away at. And so, you know, there hasn't been a wholesale removal of them, but they've certainly been picked at and shrunk over the years. The only other thing I can say on that third-party rights thing is this is one reason I'm watching out for that IBAC report when it's ever released, because while that probably won't directly address third-party rights, I hope that they have some things to say about the involvement of the community in the planning system. I ended up on their radar because I don't want to get distracted by that whole thing, but there was an issue there where there was a allegation that there was a phony community group set up to influence the planning scheme amendment process. And there seemed to be this sort of idea that, these phony community groups are a risk to the integrity of the process, and how can we guard against that? And one of the points I made that ended up quoted in a story in The Age, and that they ended up asking me to come in and talk to them about my thoughts on the system, was my point was, okay, you might have the odd phony community group set up to influence the process, but the reality is that community groups in general and the light they shed on the process through their involvement and third-party rights are really important in keeping the system clean and with greater integrity. So I hope that IBAC report, when it does come out, helps to kind of like strengthen the case for maintenance of third-party rights.
Our next question from Nancy Atkin relates to this discussion as well. Nancy, please join in.
Yes, I thought I'd just pop one in, seeing there was a bit of a gap in the questions. Which is Stephen, we were in VCAT with you over the Bunnings Glenline case, and that's the first time I've ever been in a VCAT hearing, and it's very difficult for people like myself without a planning background. So what would you see as some key ways that the planning system could be reformed to make it more friendly to ordinary community members?
Oh gosh, I mean, it is hard. I mean, you know, I am kind of I'm constantly wrestling with that, and I've got, you know, fairly detailed thoughts that I kind of like outlined at, you know, whole book length, I guess. I suppose one thing I would say, if there is a simple, if you could narrow it down to a sort of one simple idea, I think in my view, it's a lot about targeting. And what I mean by that is that the planning system is currently dealing with a huge amount of stuff. And I think that the planning system could be better targeted to focus on a few smaller things. And if the planning system was perhaps a bit better targeted, there might be a few less battles for residents to fight. But the other thing is, and this is a focus in the first edition of my book, and it's going to be a stronger focus in the second edition of my book, is, and I'm actually circling back to something that was in the previous question, was it Kim? Anyway, about the vagueness of the way planning schemes are worded. So I'm trying to write a lot more about the way planning scheme controls are written and codified, so that there is much more clarity in terms of what policy is. I'm taking a big long serve, partly inspired by the current case at 251 Lygon Street that a few of you probably know about. Preferred height limits. The idea that we have a thing called a preferred height limit. Can you think of anything more pathetic in a regulatory document like a planning scheme than to write down a preferred height limit? A planning scheme should be, you codify the height you want to achieve and you write that down and you get it. A preferred height limit is basically an admission that rather than writing down a height limit that gives you a particular height, you've written down what you would have preferred to have got rather than what you did get. It's bizarre. So there are a lot of things that could be done in terms of the way planning controls are codified and written that we could get a lot better at. So that's probably the best I've got in terms of a silver bullet answer to your question, Nancy.
Thanks, Stephen. I'd like to throw in one as well, because I think it's an issue for a lot of younger people, is the question about housing affordability, social housing, public housing. The state government, Andrew's government, has made moves around the rebuilding of public housing, doing mixed public-private projects like at Grand Place in Brunswick West. It's, I think, a bubbling election issue about the difficulty for young people to get into the housing market. How much do you think this question can be addressed by the planning scheme rather than by market forces? Should there be mandatory social housing requirements rather than, preferred social housing requirements in mega projects that might have, more than 10 dwellings in a project? Any ideas on this question about planning and housing coming together?
Okay, Joel, I'm finishing up.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if this is Dorothy Dixon, Nick, but I'm not sure if you know this, but I was on the advisory committee that fed into what ultimately became the social housing levy. And so we were asked to look at what's sometimes called inclusionary zoning. So this is, planning controls that require and larger development contributions of housing stock that can then go into the supply of affordable housing, like can get passed on to housing providers. one of the things that came out of that process is the development industry will tell you that you shouldn't have inclusionary zoning mechanisms because they will just increase the price of housing. There is a pretty strong argument that I've seen very convincingly made by a lot of very smart land economists that that's not true, particularly if you can phase it in, because essentially developers can factor the cost of an affordable housing contribution into the price they buy land for. So it's not actually the kind of like spectre that it will just get passed on to first home buyers and therefore increase housing costs. You know, people like Marcus Spiller, who are much smarter than me in the land economics of it, all say that shouldn't be a concern. The difficulty with provisions for contribution of affordable housing is you can only practically do it on really large sites if you're taking the contributions as housing. So you've got to have, you know, if someone's building 4 houses, you can't just take 5% of their 4 houses because that's, you know, that's a bathroom, right? So one reason that they ended up with the levy, I think, was it became simpler to just make it a cash contribution, because a cash contribution broadens the base. You can take a little bit from someone who's developing 4 to someone who's developing 100 to someone who's, and you take a set percentage of the value. So that's why they ended up with a social housing levy. And I think that was a very good piece of policy. And I think it is a real shame that they seem to get so scared of it so quickly. I don't know what they thought was going to happen, but they seemed to panic at what I would have thought was a reasonably predictable flurry from the property industry that would have died down in 2 or 3 weeks. That is, to me, still, I think, the policy measure that they should be pursuing. And I think it's really disappointing that they don't. They're doing all these things in terms of making it easier for them to build social housing, and that's fine. But ultimately, it's not the planning process that is the obstacle, really, in terms of building enough social housing. It's devoting the money to actually building the social housing. That's the problem. So yeah, sorry, I think I've probably answered that. I'm going to just start rambling if I keep going on.
That's good. Our time is coming to an end. I'm wondering if I could put Michael Buxton on the spot. As you mentioned earlier, Michael's someone who's also bought into the debate about planning in Victoria, now retired from his previous academic position, but
I'm not sure he's still on the call, is he?
He just
You
disappeared.
just missed him. You just
We've
missed
just
him.
missed him. Apologies. Okay. Last call. If anyone would like to make the last question, we can also mention if you'd like to check the chat room. There's a
I
notice
think
about
there's someone with a hand
yes.
up, Nick.
Yeah,
Michelle.
might have a hand. Yeah, Michelle. There
Yes,
you go.
please, Michelle, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm late to the party because I got the information late. But I just wondered, Stephen, if you had any views about major projects, because I'm dealing with the North East Link project, and the planning panels, Victoria dealt with the reference design and made conditions that were overruled by the planning minister. And then subsequent to that, NELP have amended the design without a further EES and locking out community involvement, and quite frankly misleading the community and hiding the impacts. How do you see a way of or what do you think is a solution? Because it's really quite horrible for communities that have these major projects, major infrastructure projects going through them.
It's a good question. I don't have a great answer. I think the difficulty is going to be that those really big projects, some of which are reasonable ideas, some of which are not, but you know, big projects like rail lines and big freeways and stuff are unfortunately probably always going to be subject to kind of like special processes, like the they'll probably always be subject to a degree of ministerial approval. So you are very much at the whim of the minister in that sense. I suppose the only thing I would just throw in there is you mentioned the EES process, the Environment Effects Statement process. I think it is universally recognised by anyone but the worst kind of like IPA stooge that our Environment Effects Statement process in Victoria is almost world's worst practice. It is a universally recognised, completely useless piece of legislation. I was just teaching it to students this afternoon. It has been the subject of multiple adverse inquiries, including even, you know, some of the very pro-business kind of like goons who would normally be all about, you know, all about a very facilitative piece of legislation. Can't even find much good to say about the Environment Effects Act. So that's a piece of legislation that is just absolutely in need of review, because it is very much, it is completely open-ended. It doesn't do anything to provide any kind of due process or thoroughness in terms of the way that projects are reviewed. So that is one thing I would throw into that kind of discussion. We desperately need to reform that piece of legislation. That'd be a great thing to ask candidates, whether they'll support an update with the Environment Effects Act, because the Environment Protection Act, which is one of our other major pieces of environmental legislation, did get an update in the last few years. The Environment Effects Act is still a 1978 piece of legislation that is frankly not fit for purpose anymore.
Thank you very much.
Just one quick comment. The EPA legislation is now, on the face of it, a lot stronger and better. But the EPA don't come out and investigate complaints so that we can complain about the impacts of the North East Link project, and they don't even investigate that. So it's you can have all the tools, but if you're not willing to use them, it's pretty disastrous.
And I think it's definitely an open question as to whether the EPA Act will be able to achieve its aims. Yeah, because it will depend a lot on how it's actually acted on, including the willingness of the agency, and also the extent to which courts and stuff can find in their cases in their favour when they do run cases. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to all the people who've asked questions. I'm sorry that our time is up. We're really grateful to Stephen for spending a lot of time sharing ideas, giving us some things to challenge candidates with, and appreciate his support for Brunswick Residents Network over many years. So thanks a lot. To everyone, thanks for joining us tonight. As mentioned, our candidates forum is coming up on the Thursday the 20th at the Uniting Church in Sydney Road, 214 Sydney Road, Brunswick, just south of Dawson Street. We have 5 candidates confirmed as attending for the seat of Brunswick, from the Greens, Labor, Victorian Socialists, the Reason Party and Animal Justice. We hope we've given you a few ideas of questions to bombard them with on the night. We'll be continuing to raise issues in the lead up to the state election and afterwards. So if there's anyone on the call that's not signed up to our newsletter, we have a monthly newsletter, and you can go to the Brunswick Residents Network website and just click through very simply to leave your email address, and we send that out regularly with news of planning issues and local events. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you again at our next event.